Hi, so today I will be very briefly sketching my defense of weak essentialism about gender kinds. Um, so let's get started. Um, so, what is weak kind essentialism? Um, Roughly speaking, it's just a view, or better said, family of views that for some social kind K, all members of the kind necessarily share a property or a set of properties P, such that they count as Ks in virtue of having P. And more rigorously, I define it as follows. So a property P is essential for a kind K just in case. First, all Ks must have P to count as Ks. Second, P need not be intrinsic. Third, P is salient rather than hidden. And fourth, P does not ground, explain, or necessitate any other properties of Ks. And I'm happy to discuss this further in the Q&A, but the reason why I'm adding all these conditions is because I want weak kind essentialism to be clearly incompatible with a kind of view of social kinds that models them on natural kinds. So uh, WKES formulated here is like social kinds are everything, natural kinds are not. Um, and as applied to gender in particular, weak kind essentialism about, let's say, women, I'll mostly be talking about women in this presentation, is just the view that all women, insofar as they are women, they share a common property. And if you don't have that property, then you don't count as a woman. So weak kind essentialism is supposed to be very weak. It's supposed to be compatible with a range of accounts of gender. Some of them have traditionally been considered essentialist, some have not. So all views on which women share an intrinsic feature are going to count as weakly essentialist, and of course, some will count as strongly essentialist too. But just to give you an idea, so all views on which there's some property that's intrinsic and that it takes to be a woman, they're weakly essentialist. So candidates for such properties include femaleness, sincere self-identification as a woman, a history of being socialized in the feminine gender role, etc. So all these, I'm not endorsing any of these views necessarily. I'm just saying they do count as weakly essentialist. But weak essentialism is also supposed to be compatible with the views on which all women share extrinsic features. So Haslanger's positional account is going to count as weakly essentialist on my view because she thinks that all women have in common their position of um, being subordinated along certain lines on the basis of other perceived features that they have. And to give you a better idea of what weak kind essentialism is not, here's something it's not. It's not a view on which, or it's not compatible with views such as soldiers, on which women and other gender terms are cluster concepts. So on this kind of view, we have an idea of what it is to be a woman is constituted by several components. And for an individual to count as a woman, she need not necessarily satisfy all the features in the cluster. She just needs to satisfy enough of them. And in general, the views that will rule out weak essentialism are just the views on which there's no necessary and sufficient condition you can give for someone being a woman. Okay, and well, um, here's a very standard kind of argument that's brought against weakly essentialist views. We start with what I call the diversity premise. And the diversity premise is just the simple claim that there is no one property that all women share universally, everywhere, at every context. And of course, the idea of intersectionality has played a great role in this. Members of the same gender kind, or what appears to be the same gender kind, are usually spread out across all sorts of other social categories. And um, this this multiplicity of identities that all of us have makes it extremely difficult um, for anyone to identify a single property that makes one a woman as opposed to a man or some other gender. And think of any possible candidate um, for this one property of being a woman, and you can probably come up with many counterexamples. Okay, so here's the most generic form of a diversity argument. Premise one, if weak kind essentialism is true, then all women share some property. That's just by the definition of weak kind essentialism. Then the diversity premise is it is not the case that all women share any properties. And so the conclusion is that weak kind essentialism is false. Here's a more precise, slightly more sophisticated argument. So first premise, our account of gender kinds should be existentially adequate. So it should yield a view of the kind woman that includes all prima facie women. It should not exclude any women. Premise two, there's no property that all women share. Premise three, again, if weak kind essentialism is true, then all women do share some property. However, if P2 and P3 are true, then any weakly essentialist account of the kind women will fail to include all women. And given what we know from premise one, this makes weak kind essentialism an unacceptable view. And I think these arguments work and are very persuasive as long as you accept a certain assumption. And I call it the invariantist assumption, which states that if there are gender kinds, then they are contextually invariant. So I think of this as there being a single privileged joint carving criterion for how to divide the world into, say, women and non-women. And all correct uses of the term woman are supposed to always pick out this unique region of ontological space designated by this criterion. And to be an invariantist, you can recognize that at different contexts, different historical times, different cultures, and so on, speakers have used very different criteria for what it takes to be a woman. So people who count as women today, say in the US, would not necessarily have counted as women in the 5th century BC in ancient Greece. And if you're an invariantist, you are going to recognize these contextual variations, but you're going to say that some practices that operate at certain contexts do not necessarily track the facts about gender. Some of them will be wrong. And in particular, it holds that gender membership is something that a person cannot lose or gain or change as they move from context to context. The kind women is eternal and unchangeable, and our job in giving a definition of it is to try to capture this kind. And so why does invariantism lead to the rejection of weak kind essentialism if one also accepts the diversity premise? Here's a very quick, super sketchy outline of how an argument for this might go. So first premise, we accept invariantism. Second premise, I think this is pretty obvious and independently justified. The correct account of the kind women should reflect the real distinctions in the world between women and non-women. Okay. Third premise, if 1 and 2, then the correct account of the kind women should satisfy two conditions. It should be unique. So there's one correct account of the kind because invariantism is true. And second, it should be inclusive of all women because extensional adequacy is a good desirable feature of any account of social kinds. Now, something we've seen from the diversity arguments, if a weakly essentialist account of women aims to uniquely capture the extension of the word women, then it will end up failing to include all women because there's no such thing as the one property that all women have in common. Therefore, if we accept invariantism and diversity and a fairly uncontroversial assumption about what it takes for our accounts of gender kinds to be correct, then we should reject weak kind essentialism. Okay, so there is an alternative to invariantism, and that's called ontological pluralism. And I really don't have time to defend it as much as I would like to, but I'm just going to introduce it and um, like make it clear what happens if you accept it. So pluralism about women is the view that there's no such thing as the kind women. Um, Instead, at every relevant context, there's a group of individuals who, according to the practices that operate at that context, they count as women. And accordingly, the term woman is context sensitive, so it doesn't really make any sense to talk about women simpliciter, because um, you need to like fill out every utterance of the word with the criteria for womanhood that are salient at the context of utterance. So again, we're not going to be talking about women, but about women at C1, women at C2, women at C3, etc. And the concept of a social practice is doing a lot of work in this view. So I take a social practice to be a set of patterns of behavior shared by a group of individuals, which can range from explicit and formalized to just things that regularly happen. And I take social practices to exist in order to enable individuals to coordinate or achieve shared goals. And not all social practices generate social kinds, but some of them do. And the ones that do are practices that are sets of norms, expectations, recommendation, etc., as to how certain individual should be treated or should act in virtue of their possession of a real or perceived feature. So when I say that some social practices generate social kinds, I mean the following thing. There is nothing more to the existence of a given kind K than the fact that there are some practices at some context which target individuals singled out as Ks. So in even simpler terms, all there is for there to be women, for this social kind or kinds of women to exist, is for communities to have a concept of woman and just consistently apply it to certain individuals. That's it. That's everything. And if you accept this sort of assumption about what it takes for there to be a group, then this assumption, in conjunction with the empirical claim that there are in fact different gender-related practices, so that's a diversity premise kind of thing, they together yield ontological pluralism about gender. And if you do accept ontological pluralism, then diversity arguments do not unnecessarily rule out weak kind essentialism. And here's why. So first, assume pluralism. Then again, a pretty uncontroversial premise. We've seen it before. The correct account of the kind women should reflect the real distinctions in the world between women and non-women. And then if 1 and 2, then the correct counter accounts of the kind women should be multiple. Why? Because pluralism is true. And 2, only inclusive of all the individuals who are targeted as women at some previously defined context, so the context we're actually looking at. And so if a weakly essentialist account of women, which is really just a weakly essentialist account of women at some context, if it fails to include all individuals whom we prima facie want to designate with the term women, it doesn't necessarily follow that this account is false. It might just be that it fails to capture individuals who we want to prima facie say they're women in virtue of them being women at some other context. Okay, so why would anyone want to accept pluralism, okay, I cannot go too deep into this, but I think it's because the only reason why we want to be realists about any social kinds is because they do some important work. So they explain certain phenomena, and they enable us to make predictions. And um, so, insofar as we want to explain and predict phenomena across a great variety of contexts where women, or individuals that we correctly use the term women about, where they are targeted by many different practices and they are treated in very many different ways. Insofar as we want to give explanations for such a diverse set of phenomena, we should also explain these things with very diverse kind of things. And more generally, I think that the burden here is actually on the invariantist. Even though invariantism sounds like the more natural view to take, I think most people are invariantists unreflectively. But if you're going to be an anti-pluralist, you're gonna have to be committed to this view that there are further facts beyond social practices, that there are practice independent facts about who counts and fails to count as a member of some gender or other. Because as an invariantist, you have to say that it's not the case that someone fails to be a woman just because some context doesn't treat her as a woman. So if you're gonna make that claim, then you have to support it. And I find it very hard to see how we can make sense of facts about social kinds that are independent of facts about social practices. And here's an obvious objection that always comes up. And again, I don't have time to discuss it in depth here, but I can definitely discuss it in the Q&A. So most people tend to not like pluralism initially, or contextualism about gender terms for that matter, because it seems to have some very bad consequences. So if pluralism is true, then well, social practices that are unjust and oppressive, they too generate gender kinds, and those oppressive gender kinds are also real and legitimate. And also, if pluralism is true and if contextualism about the term woman is true, then very bad utterances like trans women aren't women are going to come out true at some context. And the very, very short version of this reply is that, well, one aim of feminist theory is to describe the fact that some individuals are oppressed through exclusion or otherwise. And in order to be able to give an account of that, then we need to be able to say that there are kinds they are oppressed by. So recognition that oppressive kinds exist doesn't amount to endorsing these kinds in any way. It just amounts to saying, well, they are on the ontological landscape. We need to take them into account, and we need to recognize their existence ultimately if we want to criticize them and eventually eliminate them. So the last thing I have to say is going to be very quick. So I argued that assuming pluralism about gender kinds doesn't allow the diversity argument to go through, and so it does not entail the falsity of weak kind essentialism. But does pluralism actively require that any weakly essentialist views should be true? And I think it does. The very short answer is, if a gender kind G is nothing over and above there being a group of individuals who are targeted by a single practice, then all the individuals included in the kind already share an extrinsic property in common, namely being targeted by the same practice. And importantly, we should define practices in a way that is fine-grained enough to give us interesting explanations, to give us explanations of phenomena that are relatively unified and not gerrymandered. And if we define practices in this way, then we're going to end up recognizing the existence of multiple gender groups that are defined in a weakly essentialist manner by having this property of being targeted by the same practice, and the property itself is not going to be exclusively disjunctive or gerrymandered. So we're going to end up with a weakly essentialist view of gender kinds, which is women are individuals such that they are targeted by this particular practice at this particular context. Okay, thank you.